Hello VC, welcome back to the Vinyl Professor channel. James Griffiths here with you for, I believe, the third instalment of my series, my very occasional series, Into the Grooves. And in this video I'm going to be sort of connecting back to my very earliest VC roots. When I first tentatively joined the VC, I made one little short video. It was about 6 minutes long, and I sat at my kitchen table. I picked a record, I did the video, and I remember being absolutely amazed. I checked back about an hour later and it had picked up like, I don't know, 3 hits or something, and I was just absolutely flabbergasted. I thought, wow, 3 people have watched me sat there rambling about this record. But it was interesting, the record that I picked to talk about on that very first video, I've never revisited it, I've never gone back to it, and that video I was really embarrassed by it when I first recorded it, and I actually erased it almost immediately. So I thought I would go back and revisit the album I talked about that day. It's a record that has meant a lot to me over the years. It's one of my absolute favourite compilations of all time. It's not a record that I see discussed or shown in the VC, and in fact I don't believe I've ever seen anybody show it. Doesn't mean nobody has, just means that I've never seen it. And it is the mighty Motown Chartbusters Vol.3, which comes in this absolutely lovely shiny mirror jacket. Now I have 2 copies of this. The first copy, which I bought a long time ago, fairly battered. It's okay, but it's a little bit scummy. It needs a bit of a clean. And this is my second copy, which is a much nicer copy. I have it in a Blake sleeve. This one is pretty good. I mean, it's very hard to find these albums in good condition. The main reason being, I suspect, is that back in the day, they were classic kind of party albums, you know, back in the sort of, whatever, you know, 1970s. People would have taken these to parties, they would have played them, danced to them, got them messed up. I first heard of this album back in, it would have been probably about 1991. I saw in a British music magazine, Q magazine, used to do a feature called My Record Collection or something like that. Every issue they would interview a famous musician who would talk about their record collection and, you know, talk about various albums that they had. And in this one instalment, it was Jools Holland, ex-keyboard player from Squeeze, turned media personality extraordinaire. And this was one of the records that he mentioned. Now this was during a period, actually it was just before the period where I started to explore properly American soul music. I started to read about the Beatles, and I'd started to explore the history of 60s music, and I'd gradually become aware of the influence that Motown had had on a lot of the music that I really loved. I mean, the Beatles in particular, you know, had Motown really deep in their musical bones. George Harrison, interestingly, was a huge fan of both Motown and Stax. He used to have all the Motown singles sent to him directly from the States. And the sound of the girl groups and of Motown was hugely important to the Beatles, I think. You know, the bass playing, the sounds on these records. Were the sounds that really made the Beatles go to George Martin and say, you know, we want to have bass sounds and you know, drum sounds like on these records, because, you know, back in the day in the 1960s when the Beatles first started recording, it was very difficult to get engineers to turn up the bass and get that really heavy bassy sound which the Motown engineers, you know, had been doing since the late 50s. So I was definitely starting to become aware of how important the Motown sound was to the Beatles and to a lot of the other guitar groups that came up in the 60s. So I was kind of primed for it. I bought the album, I got it on CD originally, and then I found a couple of vinyl versions, and this has now been in my collection, you know, for a very long time, and it's still a record that I will go back to and play. It's a great one for playing if you just want to cheer yourself up, or if you want to dance around the kitchen a little bit, you know, while you're doing the washing up. As is my want. There's just something about this record, the track selection, it's just got some phenomenal things on it, and To me, it's the best one of the series. It's the most notable one, and that's why I thought I'd do this video. So let me just briefly tell you a little bit of the history. Now, I'm not going to go into the history of Motown. I'm sure you all know that. A record company launched by Berry Gordy Jr. in 1959. Motown conflates the two ideas of Motortown. Detroit obviously was a big car manufacturing place, and the Motown record label, you know, from the late 50s but particularly into the 60s, really became a byword for kind of racially integrated pop music. It was very important to the Black liberation movement and to, you know, Black pride, and it was really part of that kind of enormous ferment in the 60s, the kind of social ferment that was going on, you know, from the late 60s onwards. Incredibly important music, you know, massively influential on American and British rock music. Now the Motown Chartbusters series, and this was a fact that I actually didn't know until I started to research this video. This was a British series of records. They were released in Britain. It was not an American series of releases. These were English, British records. They were released by EMI, under license on the Tamla Motown label in Britain. In total there were 12 editions released in the UK between 1967 and 1982. Volumes 1 and 2 were actually originally called British Motown Chartbusters, and then after that the title changed to Motown Chartbusters. What happened was, by 1964 Motown had accumulated enough hits in Britain for EMI to release the original Greatest Hits Motown album, which was called A Collection of Tamla Motown Hits. This is really important to stress. You know, Motown was always massive in Britain. You know, those kind of soul records in the 1960s, they were kind of right at the heart of the mod movement. You know, they inspired bands, you know, like the Small Faces and the Who and so on. You know, hugely important to the kind of, you know, musical fabric of pop music in the 1960s. And over the next few years, several more compilations were released, including 6 in the series, 16 original big hits. But then in 1967, the label issued the first of the Motown Chartbusters series. And although the series comprised many hit singles by the various Motown artists, the albums also included other recordings that had not been hits in Britain. And many significant single hits were actually excluded from the series as well. So it wasn't exactly a greatest hit series. It did contain hits, but it also contained things that were more obscure, and it also missed out on a lot of kind of big hits. So they were quite interesting records. They weren't just a kind of quick, cheap cash-in, you know, let's just bung some of the, you know, the most well-known singles out there. It was more interesting than that. So the original albums were made by EMI under license from Motown, like I said. 12 editions spanning 15 years from 1967 to 1982, and all 12 of these records made the top 30 in the UK. The second volume rose to number 8 in January 1970, and in the same year, our album here, Volume 3, spent 6 weeks at the number 2 position, but it eventually reached number 1 in 1971. The series was really hugely successful. In fact, it was the most successful series of compilation albums until the advent of the series Now That's What I Call Music, which became obviously a huge phenomenon and maybe pushed the success story of these albums a little bit into the background. But you know, these were really big albums back in the day. Now the series was reissued by the budget label Spectrum starting in 1997. I haven't seen any of those releases. The difference between them, apparently, if you pick up one of the 1997 versions, the difference that you'll see is on the logo. The original release has the Tamla Motown logo, but the re-release just has the straight Motown. Okay, so before I start to look at some individual tracks, let's just have a look at the track list. It's quite interesting looking at the record label, because you don't get any information on that label as to who wrote the songs. You just have the names of the performers. And when I started planning this video, I kind of thought, you know, we'd look at the performers and talk about the songwriters a little bit, but then I thought, well, we can't really miss out the Funk Brothers, who was that was the band that played on all the Motown tracks. But there were so many of them, you know, and I always get confused. I always forget who they are. Let's have a quick look. Yeah, so you've got all these great names, you know, Benny Benjamin and Pistol Allen, James Jamerson. James Jamerson was a big hero of Paul McCartney. You know, Paul McCartney loved his bass playing. The Beatles always wanted to sound like the Funk Brothers. And I mean, they were just incredible musicians. They were jazz musicians, really. You know, they'd kind of, you know, go off in the evening and play jazz gigs, bebop gigs and everything. They were really accomplished. And they'd come in during the day, and it was really a kind of day job for them doing the Motown stuff. And they were so adept at coming up with these these really inventive arrangements. I particularly love their introductions. You know, the intros on Motown records are always so distinctive, and you can normally identify the song, even if you can't remember what it's called. You kind of know it from the first few bars, and it makes quite a good drinking game, actually. We'll try it now. Let's see how many of these intros, see how many of these songs you can name just from the introductions.
La la la.
So Motown Chartbusters Volume 3 starts with one of the most immortal black soul pop anthems of all time, that being I Heard It Through the Grapevine by Marvin Gaye. One of the most recognisable riffs in music. It has a kind of slinky urban groove. There's an atmosphere of claustrophobia, kind of urban paranoia. Marvin gives a fantastic agonised vocal performance. There's an incisive string arrangement. Some wonderful intricate vocal backing. It was written by Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong for Motown in 1966, and the record was produced by Whitfield. Barrett Strong, he wrote the song, he had the basics of the song, he'd started to write it in Chicago, and the idea had come to him while walking down Michigan Avenue, and people were always saying to him, I heard it through the grapevine, and that gave him the idea for a song about paranoia. You know, somebody has heard something about somebody else. The phrase actually is associated with black slaves during the Civil War, who had their own form of human telegraph, apparently, which was called the human grapevine. Now, the first recording of the song to be released was produced by Whitfield, and it was actually for Gladys Knight and the Pips. They'd released it as a single in September 1967, and that had gone to number 2 on the Billboard chart. And the Miracles recorded the song as well. and they included their version on the 1968 album Special Occasion. The Marvin Gaye version was from his 1968 album In the Groove. I don't need to say much more about this song. You know, it's just instantly recognisable. It's up there with any of the Beatles hits and the Stones hits. Just you know, a true marvel of Motown production and arrangement. So moving on now to another huge Motown anthem, and one again which is recognisable the world over. It was covered by David Bowie and Mick Jagger. We're talking about Dancing in the Street from 1967. It's a kind of clarion call, really. You know, a song of tremendous hope and optimism, bringing people together. You know, there's a deep groove, a truly epic soundscape. It sounds like the whole world is having a party, you know. I mean, goodness knows how they came up with such an enormous, gigantic sound. It's truly remarkable the way it kind of jumps off the vinyl. There's kind of orgiastic quality almost to the strings. The drums are going off like cannons. I mean, it really does outstrip Phil Spector, I think. Now, the song was written by Marvin Gaye, William Mickey Stevenson and Ivy Jo Hunter, but the idea originated with Stevenson. The idea for the song came to him from watching people on the streets of Detroit cool off in the summer in water from some opened fire hydrants, and he said that they appeared to be dancing in the water. Now, the song was conceived by Stevenson, and he showed a rough draft of the lyrics to Marvin Gaye. But at this point the song was meant to be a ballad. Marvin read the lyrics, and but he heard the potential in there for it to be a much more danceable song. Now, it was produced as a very kind of, you know, innocent dance record, a pop single, and it became the precursor to the disco movement of the 1970s. But the song did eventually take on a much more political meaning with the riots in inner city America. This led to many young black demonstrators citing the song as a civil rights kind of anthem, you know, inspiring social change and political upheaval. And when you listen to the song, it does almost sound like it's the harbinger of some kind of enormous revolution. It truly does seem to echo to the rhythms of you know, subversion and just a great feeling of coming together and all in oneness. Just what a magnificent sound. The next song I want to talk about is my personal favourite, I think, from the album. It's the song You're All I Need to Get By Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell. Now, I absolutely love Marvin and Tammy's duets. I just think they're the most inspiring sounding music of all time. This song was written by Ashford and Simpson, who were a husband and wife team. They actually wrote You're All I Need to Get By, Ain't No Mountain High Enough by Marvin and Tammy, and apparently they also wrote I'm Every Woman by Shaka Khan. And incredibly, during the recording of this song, Tammy Terrell was actually recording it from a wheelchair because she was recovering from surgery on the malignant brain tumour that would ultimately cause her death in 1970. The original recording by Gaye and Terrell was the most successful duet recording of Marvin's entire career. And I mean, you can easily hear why. It's such a beautiful, beautiful record. Marvin sings this great line, you'll be there to push me up the hill. You know, it's just a masterclass in arranging. It taps into this great kind of yearning spirit of love and mutual need. And if you know anything about the personal relationship between Marvin and Tammy, and you know, how it had a tragic ending, because you know, Marvin was absolutely devastated by Tammy Terrell's death. And that lends this song an extra kind of, you know, level of pathos.
Rejected love child, never meant to be. Love child, born in poverty. Love child.
Okay, so moving on now to this song Love Child by Diana Ross and the Supremes. From 1968. This got to number 15 in the UK charts, but actually got to number 1 in the US. written by P. Sawyer, R. Dean Taylor, F. Wilson and D. Richards, and it was produced by The Clan, which was Taylor, Wilson, Sawyer, Richards and Henry Cosby. They were a collective, it was a collective name for a group of writers who did a lot of work for Motown, which was to replace the classic famous team of Holland, Dozier and Holland. Their first effort as songwriters was this song Love Child. It was an important record for Diana because her previous two songs had been flops. They hadn't done well in the charts at all, and this was an attempt to do a different kind of song, more of a narrative story song. The idea of the song, Diana Ross sings it in the guise of a kind of illegitimate child. She's a kind of love child, and she's being pressured by her boyfriend to have a love child herself. So she's singing it from the point of view of somebody who was a love child, you know, somebody who didn't grow up in a proper family, and now she's kind of under pressure to continue that kind of, you know, vicious circle. This record became the third biggest selling Supremes song. That was after Baby Love and Someday We'll Be Together. It knocked the Beatles' Hey Jude off the top spot in the United States. It features the backing singers, the Andantes, who featured on a lot of the Supremes records instead of the Supremes.
Whenever you're near, I hide my tears behind the painted smile. You keep mad tears and sorrow behind.
Behind a Painted Smile by the Isley Brothers from 1969 was written by Ivy Jo Hunter and Beatrice Verdi. It was produced by Whitfields, Ivy Jo Hunter and Smokey Robinson. It was from their fifth album. It was their second and last with Motown. After that they got a bit disenchanted with Motown and left the label. But this is one of their most kind of powerful and anguished performances. It starts with a very uncharacteristically soft, almost classical opening with some piano and woodwind. Then there's this kind of enormous snare drum figure which just blasts the song wide open. There's a menacing fuzz tone guitar riff, sounds a bit like Satisfaction by the Stones. The whole record suggests just deep emotional distress, and it ends with this incredible sound of the drummer just whacking the snare drum. It just sounds like he's kind of just hitting it out of just sheer unbridled frustration, you know, kind of animal sexual frustration. It's a very overwrought performance.
'Cause I'm a road runner, baby.
I'm a Road Runner by Junior Walker and the All-Stars from 1966. This is a great example of Motown's kind of hard-driving, no-nonsense kind of songs. You know, a lot of the songs that we've been discussing have been, you know, songs which are beautifully put together in terms of chord sequences and melodies. But Junior Walker often did stuff that was very rooted in the blues and kind of, you know, rhythm and blues. And this song is certainly no exception. Walker plays a very distinctive tenor saxophone solo. It was discovered during the production of this record that Walker could only actually play the song in two keys. So Walker sang in a key that he couldn't play, and then after it was recorded, the saxophone track got sped up to match. Now this is just a no-frills, no-holds-barred, you know, driving R&B number. There's honking horns, there's obsessive tambourines. It just goes straight for the gut, and it contains the line which you may have heard somewhere else: I'm going to love the life I live, I'm going to live the life I love. And now the chorus only seems to go up one step or one half step, but it still manages to somehow, you know, turn the screw, and the whole thing is just a great party record, full of atmosphere, full of jubilation, and it's just got that wonderful hard driving Motown beat.
Look at my face, you'll see my smile looks out of place. If you look closer, it's easy.
So finally we come to The Tracks of My Tears by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, one of the great, if not the greatest, of Motown ballads, an immortal love song featuring a heartbreakingly lovely opening guitar refrain which everybody will recognise. it's a great example of how, you know, as in with a lot of these songs, you know, the introduction of the record often is just a little signature, either a melodic or rhythmic idea, which is absolutely pivotal to the song, and as soon as you hear it, you kind of, you know, recognise it. This song contains a wonderfully ambiguous vocal performance from Smokey. You can't quite tell whether he's just sort of hurting completely or whether on some level he's wallowing in this pain that he's in. He's, you know, he's kind of wallowing in his own heartbreak. What's great about this record is what the horns do. The horns play this figure behind his vocal in the choruses, and it's just this very mournful counterpoint because they play slightly behind the beat, and it just kind of really encapsulates his kind of you know, lovelorn, wallowing in despair kind of emotion. One of my favourite moments from the song is after the line "I need you," and there's this kind of heartbreaking stop where you feel, you know, emotionally like you've just fallen off a cliff. It just leaves you in absolute no man's land for a moment. It's a great example of how the Motown arrangers knew how to, you know, pull your heartstrings or jerk your heartstrings sometimes. Absolutely fantastic. The lyric is suffused with bitterness, resignation. You know, he's wishing with all his heart and soul that things could be different, and yet he knows full well that they're never going to be. It was produced by Smokey, written by Smokey. The song is considered to be among the finest recordings of the Miracles, and it sold over 1 million records within 2 years, making it the Miracles' 4th million-selling record. Okay, so I hope I managed to convey to you something of what this record is all about. It's always a bit difficult to describe music, but hopefully the song clips should have shown you what it has to offer. I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of people on the VC who know this record and love this record anyway. But if you don't, and you're looking for a kind of entry point into Motown, there are far worse entry points than this. Not an easy record to find in the wild anymore, at least not in good condition anyway. If you do want to check it out and you don't want to wait until you find a copy, it is available on this rather nice CD. And yeah, what can I say? What can I add? Motown Chartbusters Vol.3. In order to make up for not having talked about all the tracks, we're going to finish with a quick rundown of all the songs with some sound files for you to enjoy. So take care, VC and people of YouTube, and stand by for some more videos from me coming your way soon. Motown rules.
For once in my life, I have someone who needs me. I'm gonna try to make you love me too. So get ready, I'm on my way.
Now the time is right for me, so I'll reach down, right to the ground, and pick a rose for my rose, 'cause somehow I know she knows this love deep in my heart. But when the love light shines upon my face, I'm in a different world, a world I never knew. I'm in a different world, a world so
La 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 la, ma chérie amor.
No matter what side you are, you're gonna be mine, you are. Can't let astrology chart our destiny. No matter what side you are.
I'm sending out an SOS because I'm in so much distress, and if you see my baby,